My name is Marlowe. I am 30 years old. For a decade, my stepfather called me a childish dreamer, while my mother nodded in silent agreement, trading my future for his approval. They mocked my useless inventions at the dinner table. They sabotaged my early prototypes to fuel his own company. And eventually, they showed me the door with nothing but a suitcase and a lecture on practical reality. But last Tuesday night, under the cold glow of my porch light, the man who tried to bury my intellect was on his knees in the rain, begging for a lifeline. What Rafe Hollister didn't know was that while he was busy stealing my past, I was busy building the future. And that future just made him obsolete. The Hollisters were Pacific Northwest royalty, the kind of family whose name was synonymous with steel, infrastructure, and an ego that could block out the sun. My stepfather, Rafe Hollister, ran Hollister Global, an engineering titan built on patents and old-world grit. By the time I was 19, he was the face of the industry, with a TED Talk that had millions of views and a reputation for being untouchable. I was born an iterative thinker. Where others saw a broken appliance, I saw a puzzle. Where they saw a passing car, I saw wasted kinetic energy, just waiting to be harvested. But my passion wasn't an asset in the Hollister house. It was a nuisance. When I was 20, Rafe spent thousands on high-stakes marketing, while dismissing my sustainable energy prototypes as science fair toys. When I begged for a corner of his lab to test my energy loop theory, my mother, Aloan, just sighed into her tea. Marlowe, dear, Rafe is a professional. At some point, we have to accept that some ideas are just hobbies, not careers. I was 20. I believed her silence was my sentence. So, I learned to build in the dark. I turned my grief into obsessiveness, trading sleep for schematics and a social life for soldering irons. While Rafe was busy repackaging my stolen notes into his next product line, I was at a scarred wooden desk in a rented garage, perfecting the AUREN system, a device that didn't just supplement the grid, but replaced it. Every Sunday, before the betrayal was complete, I used to sit with my notebooks, and I'd remember what it felt like to be seen. I didn't fully understand then that being dismissed was my greatest advantage. It gave me the silence I needed to build something so disruptive, it would eventually bring a titan to his knees. But first, I had to survive 10 years of being the girl Marlowe, the impractical daughter who was never supposed to matter. Rafe Hollister did not enter our lives like a storm. He entered like a rising tide, quiet and impossible to stop. I was 19 when my mother, Aloan, first brought him home. He was almost 50, with a deep voice and a way of standing that made the rest of the room feel small. He was an engineering legend with a CV that read like a list of miracles. My mother looked at him with a kind of quiet awe I had never seen before. To her, he was the hero who could turn any idea into gold. The first time we sat down for dinner together, I tried to be part of their world. I had spent the afternoon at the kitchen table, surrounded by my prototype sketches. They were drawings of a new energy system that used vibrations to create power. I was proud of them. When Rafe walked in, he didn't look at me first. He looked at my mother, his hand resting on the back of her chair in a way that felt like he already owned the house. So, this must be the young inventor I've heard about, he said, his voice smooth and rich. He leaned over the table, peering at my sketches through expensive glasses. My heart raced. I wanted him to see the math, to understand the logic of the energy loops I had designed. I wanted a mentor. Instead, he reached out and tapped a finger on my favorite diagram. He didn't ask about the physics. He didn't ask about the scale. He just smiled. A small, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Cute," he said softly. It was a word meant for puppies or children's drawings, not for engineering. "How's school going, Marlowe? Are you still enjoying your little science projects?" The air seemed to leave the room. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to defend the hours I had spent working. But Eloin just smiled back at him, her eyes bright with admiration for his expert opinion. "She's very dedicated, Rafe," she said, her voice trailing off as if my work was just a phase I would eventually outgrow. Rafe sat down and began talking about his latest infrastructure contract. His words filled with talk of millions of dollars and global impact. My sketches were still right there on the table, but they had become invisible. Every time I tried to speak, Rafe would ask me a simple question about my classes, effectively patting me on the head with his words. He planted a seed of doubt that night, wrapped in a polite smile. I realized then that in his eyes, I wasn't a peer. I was just a girl with a hobby, standing in the way of a man who built the world. A year passed, and the seed of doubt Rafe planted had started to grow. I was 20 now, and I had learned to keep my work hidden in my bedroom. I still spent every spare minute on my energy loop system, but I stopped showing it to Rafe. I didn't want to hear another cute comment. I thought I was safe as long as my door was closed. One rainy afternoon, my mother asked me to grab a file from Rafe's home office. He was away on a business trip, and the room was quiet. As I looked for the folder, my eyes caught a thick blue binder on his desk. It was a development brief for Hollister Global's next big project. I shouldn't have opened it, but a strange feeling in my chest made me look inside. My heart stopped. There, on the very first page, was a diagram of an energy recovery system. It wasn't just similar to my work. It was my work. I saw my specific framing and the unique way I drew my energy loops. Even the labels I used for the circuit pathways were the same. Rafe had reproduced and repackaged everything I had built in my garage. I flipped through the pages, looking for my name, but it was nowhere to be found. He was presenting my child science project as his own professional breakthrough. I took the binder and ran to the kitchen, where my mother was making tea. I was shaking with anger. "Look at this, Mom," I cried, slamming the binder onto the counter. "This is my energy loop design." Rafe took my notebooks. He stole my ideas. I expected her to be shocked. I expected her to call Rafe and demand an answer. Instead, Eloin didn't even look at the pages. She just kept stirring her tea, her gaze fixed on the window. "Marlowe, don't be dramatic," she said softly. "Rafe is a world-class engineer. He's probably been working on these concepts for years. Naturally, you might have similar thoughts while living under the same roof." "It's not similar, Mom. It's exact," I screamed. He took my sketches from the dining table. He photographed my notes. My mother finally looked at me, but her eyes were cold and distant. "Rafe provides for this family. He gives us security," she said. "If he found inspiration in your hobby, you should be proud. But you cannot accuse him of theft." Her silence about the truth was louder than any lie. In that moment, everything calcified. I realized that my mother had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I wasn't just fighting Rafe anymore. I was a stranger in my own home. I closed the binder, walked back to my room, and started packing my bag. The sun had not yet come up when I finished packing. The house was silent, filled only with the soft humming of the heater that Rafe had likely installed years ago. I stood in the middle of my room, looking at the life I was about to leave behind. I only had one bag. It was a heavy canvas backpack, and it felt like it held the weight of my entire future. Inside the bag, I placed my most precious things. I packed my current notebooks, filled with the math Rafe had tried to steal. At the very bottom, tucked between two sweaters, I placed a crinkled piece of yellow paper. It was the original prototype sketch I had drawn when I was only 14 years old. Looking at those messy, hopeful lines reminded me of who I used to be, before Rafe told me my ideas were cute. It was the only thing I owned that he hadn't touched or mocked. I didn't take any of the expensive gadgets Rafe had bought for the house, or the jewelry my mother had given me for birthdays. I wanted nothing that connected me to their version of security. As I walked down the hallway, I passed my mother's bedroom door. Part of me wanted to knock. Part of me wanted to scream at her one last time for choosing Rafe's lies over my truth. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. Her silence in the kitchen the day before had told me everything I needed to know. She had traded our bond for a comfortable life in a big house. I was leaving more than just a building. I was leaving my childhood and the simple belief that family meant protection. I used to think a home was a place where you were safe to fail and grow. Now I knew it could also be a place where you were erased. I reached the front door and gripped the cold metal handle. I didn't slam it. I didn't want the drama of a loud goodbye. Instead, I stepped out into the cool morning air and pulled the door shut until I heard the quiet click of the lock. That small sound was the end of my life as Marlowe Quinn, the impractical daughter. I walked down the driveway without looking back, my one bag heavy on my shoulders, ready to build a world where I would never be invisible again. The next 10 years were not filled with light or fast success. They were built in the shadows of small labs and cheap apartments. I worked 3 jobs just to pay for the parts one needed to keep my dream alive. While Rafe was busy giving speeches about the future, I was living it in the middle of the night, surrounded by wires and the smell of hot metal. I became a master of iterative thinking, which just meant failing 1,000 times until I found the one way that worked. I made partners with people who didn't care about my name or my past. They only cared about the math. We went through dozens of failed versions of my energy system. My life became a cycle of quiet obsession. I would spend weeks on a single circuit, testing it until my eyes blurred. There was one winter night when my 3rd prototype caught fire, destroying months of hard work. I sat on the floor and cried, almost ready to give up and admit that maybe Rafe was right about me being a dreamer. But then, I looked at my old sketch from when I was 14. I realized that if I stopped now, Rafe would win forever. I went back to work. I stopped looking for someone to tell me I was doing a good job. I realized that my worth didn't come from Rafe's approval or my mother's attention. Finally, the version that worked emerged. The outgrowing device. It was small, clean, and powerful. It was a compact, scalable system that could change how the whole world used energy. It was everything Rafe's stolen ideas were not. When I filed the patent, I did it quietly. I didn't want a party. I just wanted the world to see that a useless idea could change everything. The market response was like a tidal wave. Companies from all over the world wanted the outgrowing technology. It disrupted global markets and made me a billionaire before I turned 30. But I didn't buy a mansion or go on TV. Instead, I stayed in my minimalist apartment and watched the data on my screen. I saw the numbers showing how many homes were now powered by my child's science project. I felt a strange, heavy feeling in my chest. It wasn't the loud joy I had imagined years ago. It was something quiet and steady that I didn't immediately recognize as winning. I wasn't the girl who had been kicked out anymore. I was the person who had redesigned the world while the people who doubted me were still sleeping. I had outgrown Rafe so completely that his power over me had simply vanished. The success of the outgrowing device was unlike anything the industry had seen before. It wasn't just a local hit. It went global almost overnight. Suddenly, my name was everywhere. Magazines and news shows begged me for interviews, wanting to write profile pieces about the mystery inventor who had come out of nowhere. I declined every single one. I didn't want to be a celebrity or a face on a screen. I wanted the work to be the only thing that mattered. My wealth grew until I was a billionaire before the age of 30, but it did not feel like a destination. Instead, it felt like a side effect of doing the work correctly and staying focused on long-term impact rather than public praise. I spent my days in a minimalist apartment that was high-end but subtle, filled with smart lighting and clean lines. It was a space defined by precision and calm, a sharp contrast to the chaotic house I grew up in. While the world talked about my success, I stayed quiet and kept working. One evening, I sat in my quiet living room and opened a well-known technology journal. I found an article reviewing the latest product from Hollister Global, Rafe's company. As I read the technical breakdown, I felt a chill run down my spine. The experts noted major design limitations in his system. It was inefficient. It struggled with heat, and it could not scale to meet the needs of the modern world. These problems mirrored, almost perfectly, the flaws in my very first prototype from a decade ago. It was the child science project he had mocked, yet he had built his entire future on it. Rafe was still using the version of the technology he had stolen from my notebooks when I was 20. Because he had never understood the why behind my designs, he could not fix the mistakes. He was stuck in the past, trying to sell an idea that I had already spent years fixing in isolation, through hundreds of failed tests. My upgraded AREN system had dominated the market and made his version completely obsolete. I realized then that Rafe hadn't just stolen a project, he had stolen a dead end. By pushing me out, he had forced me to iterate and grow until I was light years ahead of him. I closed the journal and looked out at the city lights. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of the old wound. I just felt the truth. I had outgrown him so completely that he had destroyed his own power. He was still fighting to be right, while I was busy being relevant. It was a Tuesday night, and the rain was hitting my windows with a steady, heavy rhythm. Inside my apartment, the air was warm and smelled of clean wood and quiet success. The lighting was smart and recessed, casting a soft glow over my workspace. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the latest data for AREN, when the doorbell rang. I didn't get many visitors, especially not at this hour. I stood up and walked to the door, my hands steady as I gripped the dark wooden handle. When I opened it, the cold night air rushed in, smelling of wet pavement and old regrets. There, standing in the shadows of my porch, was the past. Rafe Hollister was kneeling on the wetwood, his expensive suit wrinkled and soaked through with rain. He looked much older than I remembered. His hair was messy, and his eyes were searching mine for a kindness I no longer owed him. He looked like a fallen architect, sitting in the ruins of his own building. "Marlowe," he said, his voice cracking. He tried to straighten his shoulders, attempting to sound like the powerful man he used to be. "I'm glad I found you. I thought we could have a professional talk." One engineer to another. A courtesy call, really. I didn't answer. I simply stepped back, keeping one hand on the edge of the door, and let him speak. I was the gatekeeper now, and he was the one waiting outside in the dark. He started talking about the energy market and how my technology was changing things. He tried to use big words and technical terms to make it sound like a business meeting, but I could see the desperation in his eyes. He wasn't there for a professional chat. He was there because his world was ending. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped as if he were praying. He spoke about market shifts and synergy, trying to hide the fact that his company was bankrupt. I watched him quietly, my face set in a calm, analytical line. I had been ready for this moment for 3 years. I knew that his company was failing because he was trying to sell a broken version of my old dreams. I knew that the technology he had stolen from me a decade ago had finally hit a wall. He had run out of lies and run out of money. As he kept talking, trying to frame his visit as a favor to me, I realized that I didn't feel the anger I expected. I just felt a deep sense of stillness. He was kneeling on my porch, looking up at me, while I stood in the light of the success I had built for myself. The power reversal was complete. I let the silence stretch between us, the only sound being the rain falling on the roof. Rafe continued to talk, his voice rising over the sound of the rain. He spoke about his company's old designs, trying to sound like a man who had simply met a string of bad luck. But as he went on, he started using very specific words. He talked about asymmetrical energy loop framing and latent vibration recovery. These were not common engineering terms found in textbooks. They were the exact names I had invented in my private notebooks when I was 19 years old. He was using my own vocabulary to explain why his current systems were failing. He didn't realize that by using those words, he was showing me exactly how much he had taken. He was accidentally confessing that his entire career for the last 10 years had been built on the pages he had photographed from my desk when I wasn't looking. He thought he was speaking to a peer who might feel sorry for him, but he was really speaking to his victim. He was standing on the ruins of a stolen empire, still trying to act like the architect. I waited for a break in his nervous speech. When he finally paused to catch his breath, I leaned forward slightly. I kept my voice very quiet, which made him go completely still. "Rafe," I said, "where did you first encounter the energy loop framing you used in the 2016 development brief?" The silence that followed was the axis point of the entire story. The air on the porch seemed to freeze. Rafe's mouth stayed open, but no words came out. His eyes widened, and I saw the moment the truth hit him like a physical blow. He realized that I hadn't just moved on or forgotten. I had been watching. The twist detonated in the small space between us. He hadn't just found inspiration in my work. He had systematically dismantled my confidence, so he could steal my core concepts without anyone asking questions. He had sabotaged my early prototypes on purpose to make sure I would never be his competition. He had traded my future for his own profit. I had suspected this for years. I had felt it in my gut every time I saw his company's updates or heard him speak on the news. But seeing the blood drain from his face made it a certainty. He wasn't just a greedy man. He was a thief who had tried to destroy a young girl's spirit to protect his own ego. He had used my mother's silence as a shield to hide his crime. He waited for me to scream or call the police. He expected a reaction that matched the size of his betrayal. But I didn't react. I didn't need to. My heart didn't even speed up. I simply looked down at him with the calm eyes of someone who had already won. I had already prepared for this moment 3 years ago, when I first saw his company's numbers start to drop. I didn't need to get even, because the Aurian device had already done that for me. He was kneeling in the rain, and I was the one holding the keys to the only thing that could save him. I did not say another word to him. I turned my back on the rain and walked into my warm, quiet living room. Rafe stayed outside, a shadow against the dark night. I went to my desk and picked up a folder I had prepared months ago. I had always known this night would come. Logic told me that a man who builds on a stolen foundation will eventually see his walls crumble. I walked back to the door and stepped onto the porch, where the cold air met me once again. I did not hand the folder to him. I did not want our hands to touch. Instead, I placed it on the wooden railing between us. The paper was protected by a clear cover, so the rain just slid off the surface like it was made of glass. "This is a licensing agreement," I said. My voice was calm and steady, like a teacher explaining a lesson to a student who had failed. "It is the only way your company survives the month." Rafe reached out with a trembling hand, but I did not let him open it yet. I explained each part with the precision of an engineer who had checked every calculation. I had rehearsed this not as a performance, but as a principle of justice. "There are 4 rules you must follow if you want my help," I told him. First, full attribution. You will admit in writing that the core technology belongs to me and always has. Second, ethical compliance. You will never again sabotage a competitor or hide a design flaw to save money. Third, environmental governance. Your factories must meet the highest green standards I have set. And fourth, supply chain transparency. Every part you use must be sourced fairly and honestly. I watched him as he read the words through the rain-blurred plastic. These were the values he had laughed at 10 years ago, when I was just a girl in his house. He had called my ideas naive and impractical, saying that the real world didn't work that way. Now, the real world had proven him wrong. These values were the only things that could keep his workers employed and his name out of bankruptcy court. He could save his company, but he would have to do it by finally living the way I believed in. Rafe looked up at me, his face pale and small in the porch light. He knew he had no choice left. He took a pen from his pocket and signed the document right there in the rain. His signature was shaky and weak, a tiny mark of defeat on a page of my triumph. I watched him as he pulled the folder toward his chest. I thought I would feel a great surge of joy or a sense of revenge. I thought I would want to laugh at how far he had fallen. But as I looked at the man kneeling at my feet, I felt something much quieter. It wasn't satisfaction. It was a strange sense of completion. The loop was finally closed. I wasn't the girl who had been kicked out anymore. We were just 2 people in the rain, and I was the only one who was truly free. After Rafe disappeared into the rainy night with the signed folder, the silence in my apartment felt different. It was no longer the silence of someone hiding. It was the stillness of someone who had finished a long journey. I sat on my sofa, watching the city lights blur through the wet glass. Then, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a name I had not seen on my screen in a very long time. Mom. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. My mother's voice was small and hesitant, a sharp contrast to the confident woman she had tried to be while standing next to Rafe. We spoke for a long time. The conversation filled with 10 years of things we had been too afraid to say. It was imperfect and messy. There were long pauses where the only sound was the static of the line and the rain outside. "Marlowe," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw the news about your company months ago. I wanted to call, but I didn't know how to face you. After Rafe told me what happened tonight, I realized I can't stay quiet anymore." She took a shaky breath. "I should have said something back then. I should have stood up for you when he took your notebooks. I've known that for 10 years, and I am so sorry." I listened to her admission, waiting to feel a rush of anger or a sense of relief. Instead, I felt a strange, calm weight. Her apology didn't fix the 10 years I spent working in cold garages, and it didn't give me back the childhood I lost. "I'm not ready to say everything is fine, Mom," I told her honestly. One phone call doesn't change the decade I spent alone. But I'm listening. It wasn't full forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of a door reopening. We didn't make grand promises. We just agreed to talk again. When I hung up, I walked over to my large window. Behind me, the soft blue indicator light of an ARN device glowed on my desk. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. The heartbeat of the future I had built with my own two hands. I stood there for a long time, looking out at the world. I thought about the girl who left home with one bag and a crinkled sketch. She had wanted to prove everyone wrong. But the woman standing here now didn't need to prove anything anymore. I decided, slowly and on my own terms, that I was willing to see what rebuilding a relationship looked like. I wasn't doing it because I owed it to my mother, and I certainly wasn't doing it for Rafe. I was doing it because I wanted it for myself. For the first time in my life, what I wanted was a good enough reason. I was finally the architect of my own peace. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the rain wash the city clean. In the reflection of the glass, I saw a woman who was no longer defined by the people who had tried to break her. For years, I thought my success was about the money or the patents. I thought winning meant standing on top of a mountain while Rafe looked up from the bottom. But as the soft blue light of my invention filled the room, I realized the truth was much deeper. I did not win because I was smarter than Rafe, even though my math had proven to be better. I did not win because I was faster or richer. The real victory was that I never became him. Rafe built his world out of ego and stolen ideas. He built things to prove he was powerful. And because that power was fake, it eventually fell apart. He spent his life looking for shortcuts and taking credit for work he didn't understand. If I had spent my life only trying to get revenge, I would have been just like him, driven by bitterness instead of creation. Instead, I chose to build things that mattered. I focused on solving problems and helping the planet, even when no one was watching. I stayed in the garage and did the hard work because I believed in the ideas themselves, not the fame they might bring. This was the big secret. Things built to prove something usually crumble, but things built to matter are made to last. My technology was strong because it was honest. As I turned away from the window, I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt since I was a little girl. I had outgrown the need for Rafe's respect. I had even outgrown the need for my mother's protection. I was my own foundation now. The ARN device on my desk continued to pulse with a steady light, a reminder that the truth always finds its way out of the dark. I had not just survived the storm. I had learned how to use its energy to power the future. I walked toward my desk, ready to start on the next idea. Not because I had something to prove, but because I had so much more to build.